Hi everyone, and welcome to this new study log. So today we're going to talk about pre-registration and talk about registered reports. And in doing so, I might answer some of the questions like, why do I have to follow the plan that's suggested? Why can't we change things? And why are we even making it clear what we're doing beforehand? So I'm hoping you'll be able to answer these questions following the session. So we're going to focus on pre-registration to start. Now, we know the research cycle, as you can see it here. There's lots of different stages, okay? And what happens when we have researchers put under pressure to go around this cycle as quickly as possible is that people make strategic choices at each point in this research process to try and quicken things up and increase the likelihood that they will, for example, get publications, get citations, and generally be seen as a great academic person. So to do this, they can do a number of different things. Typically, these can range from problematic practices like fraudulently making up data to practices which are not great, but are nevertheless okay. So, for example, choosing to do a study on a completely new area rather than trying to kind of replicate or build upon something that already exists. And so these are a number of key kind of decisions in red that have been highlighted that may compromise our understanding and our sense of building an incremental body of evidence to inform practice. So we'll start at the typical starting point of a research project, which is hypotheses and development of the study itself. And when we do that, traditionally speaking, researchers and indeed publishers prioritize novelty as an assessment criteria for whether a paper gets accepted. Now, I can dress my cat in all sorts of different novelty little coats and bells and things and test how fast they can run around my house. And that would be a novel piece of research. But novelty for me doesn't equate to quality in any way. And what happens when people choose novel research streams rather than kind of provide incremental steps in building upon existing research more is that you get a very disparate field of understanding, and you get a very inconsistent and fragmented body of work from which you can base action. And that's not something you can confidently decide, recommendations for practice from. So that's one of the problematic choices that we make, is that because there is this emphasis upon novelty, we tend to avoid things like checking that what we're doing or what has been done is good and correct. We also have the issue of low statistical power. People often conflate this with small sample sizes, but they often go hand in hand. We often don't have enough participants to be able to make confident claims about the effects that we report. And this is highly problematic because it means we could be championing and perpetuating spurious claims without the necessary evidence to confidently assert. Around the process of collecting data and analysing data, we have the issue of p-hacking. And this is where people essentially conduct lots of different analyses to try and find ones that have p-values of less than 0.05, subsequently making claims that are statistically significant, which are, again, far easier to publish than those which, for example, find null effects where there is no such an effect. And then finally, when we also kind of at this interpretation stage, in addition to stuff like p-hacking, we can also do what's known as harking, or hypothesizing after results are known. And this just basically means changing your hypotheses or changing the narrative of your study so that it fits with what your data tells it to. Now, obviously, what you originally planned in terms of why you did that study, its theoretical framework, and then subsequently what you write about because of the results can be highly different. And this is problematic. More often than not, it just provides a distorted view of what people are doing and why. And then at the final stage around dissemination, we have a lot of different issues. We'll cover two here. The first is publication bias, broadly representing the fact that papers that find statistically significant findings are more likely to be published than those with null or non-significant findings. And lack of data sharing, and more broadly resource sharing and material sharing. And this undermines our ability to reproduce findings and to be able to test whether we can recreate the results from the analyses, or indeed run other types of analyses and make other analysis decisions and see whether we come to the same conclusion. So from across the research cycle, we've got issues, and it's very easy to think, well, these are just things done by bad researchers, and they are few and far between. But what a lot of meta research has told us recently is that there are high prevalence rates of these specific experiences and these specific behaviours. To cut to the chase, here are some of the estimates provided by some of the existing literature. So, for example, we find that when we try and request sharing data, so when somebody said data is available upon reasonable request, you provide a reasonable request, you're about 30% of the time you're likely to get the data you want. Funnily enough, a lot of people just ignore those emails, or indeed say no. And similarly, 92% of the existing literature is based upon kind of positive or statistically significant findings, and very little represents null or non-significant findings. And these, you can see the prevalence of these issues throughout the research cycle. And this is clearly a problem. It tells us there's lots that we need to start changing and thinking about the way we do research to help challenge this and to do something about it. So we have this process, and in essence, the quality of what we do along the way really is only evaluated right at the end. So when we decide to disseminate our work and attempt to publish it, all the outcomes come from this. So we hope to get published, so we get a better job, tenure, promotions, fame, research students to help us. And the same for when we get published, and then that all contributes into our next experiment. And so you can see how findings driven by questionable results could be perpetuated. And in doing so, we have a distorted system whereby the incentives for doing good quality research are perhaps not quite there. Whereas what we're encouraged and promoted and rewarded for doing is going around that circle as many times as possible and as quickly as possible. And you see lots of people boasting online about their H index or their number of publications, and that's just peacocking, really. It doesn't matter. These things don't matter. It should actually be more about the quality of the work you do and the impact that your results can have. But that's not the current case. We're not rewarded for doing a really good job collecting the right number of participants, or a reasonable number of participants. And so what we have then is this conflict. We have this paradox where there's a bit of conflict between what part of the research that should be beyond our control. So we should control everything about the study design, the way we look at it, but what the results tell us, well, that should just be what the results tell us. But unfortunately, the thing that is most important for advancing our career, for securing publications, for securing grants and other such outcomes, are the results. And so this conflict, this paradox, is that we shouldn't touch the results, but we should do whatever we can to make them as amazing as possible. And clearly this isn't possible. Right, and so people engage in these sorts of behaviours I've described to try and kind of facilitate outcomes without thinking that they're perhaps being too naughty. And so there's this conflict. What is good for science is high quality research, whether it's published regardless of outcomes. So it doesn't matter whether it tells us there's no effect or there is an effect of any given relationship or intervention or whatever. It shouldn't matter what the effect is. It should be that we've come to a conclusion we can trust because we've used robust and rigorous methods and procedures. But that's not what's best for scientists. What's best for scientists as individuals is that we produce a load of great results, exciting, sexy results that help us churn around this research cycle as quickly as possible. And so what I want to highlight here is that it's not a personal issue. It's not an individual issue. What we have is a distorted system. It's a structural system. You can see some of it here where we constantly assess researchers and evaluate research processes on the outcomes, which puts pressure to publish, which means that people try and do lots of things, picking out the most sexy, exciting results. Then it kind of perpetuates that because they get more citations, and you can see how this system perpetuates itself. It is inherent within this, it's built into the system. So this is not a bad researcher issue. It is a bad research system issue. And you may go, okay, well that's all well and good. You're a bit cynical, Tom, but okay, I'll take your word for it that there are pressures that perhaps make people make suboptimal decisions. But there are other quality processes involved. So it's not just researchers. It's for example journals, and journals have a role. So peer review, that should defend our quality, right? And when we have a look closely at that, we should also question this principle. So what do journals want? Journals are businesses. They want to make money. They're not strongly motivated by quality at all. Right? What they're motivated by is quantity, article processing charges that researchers pay to publish within their pages. And so they want people to buy, to read, to cite the journal. And so they look for papers they consider to be important, novel, especially clear, or ones that try and break new ground or confirm new hypotheses. What they don't want to do is spend. The more they spend, the less profits they have. And so the things that retain quality, so for example, paying reviewers, just doesn't happen. They are motivated to keep articles as short as possible because the more space they take up, the more work's needed to manage them, and to not spend any effort or time or resources on reviewing, fact-checking, doing any sort of quality evaluation. And so what you get here, as you can see in this wonderful diagram, is the fact that the profit margins of academic publishing are massive. And this is even in comparison to industries where there is expectations for extremely high profit levels. So places like Apple or Google, which have insane profit levels. So what we have is a problem. We have a distorted system, researchers within that trying to do their best, but nevertheless succumbing to the temptation to engage in these practices to facilitate their own personal outcomes and goals. And so what should we do about it? So recently, because of the replication crisis that I discussed in the previous session, we have got a movement called open science or open scholarship. And this contains lots of different dimensions or elements. But it really prioritizes openness and transparency throughout the research cycle. So as you can see here, it doesn't just focus on the end dissemination of the results, but it considers everything like the diversity of knowledge we engage with to design our study, whether we share data, whether we have resources from that can be openly shared. And so whilst open science is seen as a big blob of things, I like to think of it as like a buffet, right? You pick which things are most important, relevant, and impactful to your particular study. And so you can see a few more examples here of the different kind of practices which are kind of contributing to this movement. But today I want to focus specifically on pre-registration. And this is the practice of publishing the plan for a study. So things like your research question or hypotheses, your research design, your data analysis, all before the data has been collected or examined. And this is the FORT, F-O-R-R-T glossary definition of pre-registration. And so I guess the goal here is to provide transparent documentation of what you planned at a certain time point and allow other people to be able to access this and see what happened, following the data collection, following the dissemination process. And so it's time-stamped and typically registered with an independent party, so a repository. The Open Science Framework is a popular one. And that it's publicly shared with others, sometimes after an embargo period where there's a bit of delay, sometimes not. And this is a really flexible strategy. So typically what people do is complete templates and then upload them to these repositories. And you can do loads of things with it. So you can do qualitative research, quantitative, secondary data analyses, all of these sorts of things. But what it expects of you is to make decisions about your approach, about your focus, about your analyses, and publicly disseminate them before you do the work. And in doing so, you can't be accused of things like harking, hypothesizing after results are known, because it's impossible to do so if you made a public declaration of what you expect to do. And some people are worried about pre-registration, thinking it's only good for confirmatory research and that it's a kind of prison, that it forces you to do what you said you would do. Now, obviously, you should try wherever possible to do what you say you would do. But people should think about pre-registrations as a plan, not a prison. So they're an opportunity to think about what you're going to do and declare them before you actually do the work. And I personally have found this an incredibly useful strategy because it encourages you to think in a much greater detail about exactly why you're doing something. And this is, I guess, really important for me, particularly in context of this research project, because when we do dissertations and research projects as part of an undergraduate or a master's dissertation, we often have this broad idea of what we want to do or how we're going to do it. But the actual detail, and this is where pre-registration is so important, the actual detail about what you're going to do is often forgotten about. So, for example, we might have, we're interested in the difference between men and women on a certain psychological attribute. And that's our kind of general principle of focus. But the way in which we're going to analyze the data, so, not just a t-test, but on what basis are we going to include or exclude certain participants within that data. These sorts of levels of detail actually can change the outcomes you draw. So they're really important to be able to say, I'm saying these things up front, this is how I'm going to do it. And then obviously if things change later, you can just declare that we deviated from our pre-registration in this way, and this is why. And this is never seen as problematic. Because it's about being transparent. It's not about being a smarty pants and get everything right from the very start, because you can't. So I've alluded to some of these already, but why should we pre-register or pre-reg? So there's loads of things to consider. Now, what we have at the moment is no limitations to what you can do. So you collect data and you analyze it in whichever way you want. And you come to whatever conclusions you like based on whatever criteria you like. And so you've got lots of what are known as researcher degrees of freedom, right? These are all small decisions, behaviours, things that you can do along the research kind of trajectory, which might change the outcome of the study. You can make any decision whether you include or exclude certain types of people or above or below a certain type of score. And so what we have at the current setup is it's also termed the garden of forking paths, right? You can go in any number of different directions and it doesn't matter which, because, you can go whichever works best out for you. And that means you can go down a path, work out whether it's a nice outcome or a bad outcome, come back and try a different one. And obviously this is, things like selective reporting of findings and all sorts of things tends to be quite problematic. It's not like research always has a clear, this is the way to do it. There are loads of nuances. But being able to be kind of focused and justify why you choose this decision rather than this decision is really important. Pre-registration can also stop people from being opportunistic, collecting any data wherever they like as quickly as they can and throwing something together. It's actually about being slowing down that science, if at all. I mean, pre-registration doesn't have to slow it down, but to stop and think about what you're doing and why you're doing them, and get rid of kind of opportunistic findings and opportunistic data collection. And it also encourages us to make decisions for quality rather than for desirable outcomes. So, I'm not choosing this analysis approach because it creates this sort of outcome, but I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do for this study design, for this population, for this sample. And so pre-registration can help, or it's claimed to support the prevention of stuff like p-hacking, harking, study design issues, and gives us an opportunity to think and consider about these different factors. So pre-registration is broadly used as a technique to facilitate transparency. And there's loads of reasons why this is super useful. For example, it helps other people evaluate our work and be able to see how good, or indeed perhaps how bad it is. And it provides us with a paper trail of the research, so it doesn't really matter whether or not it gets published or not, in that people can still see it occurred, it happened, that research happened. And so in doing so, it helps kind of tackle this issue of publication bias, where we tend to see only significant findings in the literature. If I was to do a literature review, I might find your pre-registration and see that you attempted to do this certain thing, and perhaps it led to certain outcomes, and that's why you didn't publish it. So it can help and contribute towards publication bias. It also kind of helps save time and defend you. So traditionally in the research process, you get no feedback until right at the end. And then you might get told, no, you have to change the way you view this, you change your perspective. Whereas with pre-registrations, you've said what you're going to do. So it prevents people from carking, which is critiquing after results are known, just like harking, carking. So people can't expect you to change your hypotheses after you've written up your manuscript, or you can't reframe your work around a new perspective or approach. It's done for the reasons you stated it would be done, and it saves you from having to defend yourself against these sorts of critiques. And this sort of recognition is also helpful for recognition, because it shows that you've really deeply engaged with the process and there is more stuff out there of your particular project. So previously, where we might have tried to attempt to find everything about a certain research project and we simply find the end manuscript, where you have pre-registration and you've got all the materials as part of your pre-registration, so your analysis plan or your materials, there's a bank of resources there that people can find and can see, and you can also be recognised and rewarded for that. So, for example, if your data set gets seen by somebody else, and they use it and they cite your work and stuff, so there can be a number of benefits to that sort of transparency. We can also value pre-registration for severity, and according to Larkins, this is the primary reason why you should pre-register, is that it supports being able to tell the severity of a test. So a statistical test is severe when it is highly capable of demonstrating a claim is false. And you can see it on the image on the top right here. So where we have a two-sided test, all we really try and work out is if the result is 0. And so obviously, it doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, small or large. It's not particularly useful. It doesn't tell us that much. It tells us basically it's not 0. Where we have a one-tailed test, it just shows us half of that. And equally, if we have a particular research project designed on an effect, looking at it in with a particular boundary or particular kind of predicted range, that tells us a lot. And so pre-registration is useful because it tells us the severity of the tests we're doing. It tells us what exactly we're tested for, because we've done it before the data collection, where we are in this kind of scale of severe and not severe. Okay, it provides transparency, right? It provides a transparent account of what was expected from the research and how we're going to test for this particular effect or claim or hypothesis. Hopefully you can see that pre-registration covers a lot of these sorts of kind of outcomes. So, for example, if we pre-register our hypotheses and our analysis plan, we find that the result or the effect is non-significant. We then can see that this might help prevent this publication bias. It might help stop us getting rejected from journals because we said we'd pre-register and we said this is what we do. And so it might mean that the existing literature might reflect more null or non-significant or smaller findings. So that's great. And you can see how there's a variety of different ways pre-reg could probably help with a few of these. So how do most people do it? This is typically through templates, and you can see a number of examples here. So the Open Science Framework have a good range. So this includes replication recipes, ones for social psychology specifically, or qualitative research. It's been a real expansion in the range of templates available. Or you can use what's known as aspredicted.org, which is very, very user-friendly, but very simplistic, and it's basically a number of questions where you kind of fill out, and then it goes live. So it depends on what you know how complex your research is as to what you do or how far you go. We're going to take it a full step further. So let's think about pre-registration not as a thing to do before a normal research project, but embed the ideas of pre-registration and the opportunities for feedback into what's known as a registered report. So this is a completely different publication pathway based upon pre-registration. And this is basically how I do the vast majority of my research now, because I find it's a better way of working. So it's on the basis that the results of your research don't matter. So if you do a good process, you do good quality research at each of those stages across the research cycle, it doesn't matter what the results tell you, whether they're significant or not, right? The key here is to make it dead currency. It just doesn't matter. What we should care about is the question we ask with our research, the quality of the methods we use, just not the results. And if we accept this proposal, then really we should look at having editorial decisions, that is, editors making decisions about whether to publish or not publish our paper, blind to the results, right? They shouldn't be able to access the results because that might guide their decision making. And so this initially was suggested, okay, well, perhaps we just do results blind publications. And so we just remove the results section and, people can essentially be accepted for publication without that section, and it's then later added on. What we do with registered reports is kind of an expansion of that, and I think the most common sense and useful expansion of that. So we have a two-step process. The first step of the process is that authors or researchers, people like me, would write a paper with the introduction, the procedure, the method section, and any plans for analyses all together. So they essentially, up to the results section of a paper, they write it before they're collecting data, and they submit this for peer review. So like it would traditionally happen right at the end of the process, we now bring it earlier. So we get a more useful window for feedback. And they will look at everything you prepare. So the manuscript, your analysis plan, your materials. If you've done any kind of mock data analysis or anything like that, they'll consider all of this. And they will then provide some kind of evaluative judgments. And these are the criteria on the side. So are the hypotheses well-founded? Are the methods and proposed analyses feasible and sufficiently detailed? Is the study well powered, and have you sufficient positive controls to confirm that the study will provide a fair test? And so that's what they analyse, okay, as a peer reviewer. And what happens next? If you get through that process and they're saying, yes, we're happy that everything you've done is quality and is a worthwhile contribution, what you then get offered is in principle acceptance, or IPA. And basically, this is your pre-registration protocol. This is your pre-registration. You publicly present this, in some sort of repository, and you have got a guaranteed publication, basically. So now you've got the plan, it's been peer reviewed. What you have to do is fulfill the plan. So you do the research, and then you resubmit a stage 2 publication. So this is where you leave everything you've done thus far as it was. So introduction methods, you are virtually unchanged, perhaps updated with specific numbers of participants or these sorts of things. And then you also provide the results and the discussion section. This is the kind of new content, as it were. And you deposit everything like the data and materials in a public archive. Now, unlike the traditional peer review process, this actually then undergoes peer review again. Now, this is less of an intense scrutiny, but what it does is it allows reviewers to assess compliance with the protocol. So, did you comply with your pre-registration? Did you do what you said you would do? Were the quality checks that you said you'd do passed? Are the conclusions and the discussion kind of arguments you make concurrent with the data that you produce and the results that you found? And then, subject to that peer review, your manuscript is published. And there have been virtually no cases where at this point pre-registrations and registered reports have been rejected. Basically, if you go through this process, you do what you said you'd do. Even if you deviate, as long as you transparently report what you did and why, it's still fine. And you get a publication. And I really, really value this approach because it puts all the hard work right at the start. So you've got to really think about what you're going to do, how you're going to collect your data, how you're going to analyze your data, what might those conclusions be, how might you then kind of think about what we can do to improve quality control throughout the whole process. It's a really exciting and different way of thinking about scientific publication. And it's cool because it doesn't matter whether you support your hypotheses. It genuinely has no impact on whether you get published or not. So, we're removing the publication bias right away here. It doesn't matter whether your p-values are more or less than 0.05 or indeed any other random arbitrary drawn number. It doesn't matter whether your results are novel, whether they successfully find what you thought they would do or not. And it doesn't matter whether the results have impact or not. It really just doesn't matter. And I feel this is a really successful approach. So as somebody who is an editor for registered reports, as an author who does registered reports, this process is a really useful way of increasing the quality of research. And don't take my word for it. There have been some meta-research kind of studies looking at the outcomes of registered reports. The claims are of these. So they are claimed to be far more reproducible than traditionally published manuscripts, in that you have a much more detailed and repeatable method section, so you can reproduce it and you have all the materials there to be able to do so. And also, by nature of the assessment of registered reports, they look at your planned sample size, and so you should have sufficient statistical power. It's also incredibly transparent, so it's nearly always accompanied by either open data and or open materials and or other open resources. And it allows us to differentiate between confirmatory and exploratory analyses. So confirmatory being the ones that we intended to originally set out to study, and the exploratory ones which perhaps we, once thinking about it more, thought that this also might be useful to look at, or some subgroup analysis or something similar. And it also gives us credibility. So there's no publication bias, there's no hindsight bias, there's no selective reporting of outcomes, because we're reporting exactly what we said we would report. And from the perspective of the authors, you get expert reviewers as and when it's most useful in the research process, which is before you've wasted any resources or time collecting data. It's got a high acceptance rate. So, for example, at Cortex, which is mostly focused on neuropsych papers, 90% of regular articles are rejected, but only 10% of stage 1 registered reports are rejected after in-depth review, and 0 have been at stage 2 have been rejected. You're more likely to get accepted by the first journal you submit to, because it's seen as a more developmental process rather than a gatekeeping process. You get a paper accepted before you start the research, so regardless of whatever the results tell you, you're guaranteed you're going to get an outcome from it. And as I'll come on to in just a second, the articles tend to be well cited because they come up with various kind of high quality indicators that people want to publish. And so citation numbers tend to be quite good for this as well. So we can see here a few of the meta research evaluations of registered reports. So on this left-hand side, you can see the percentage of findings which represent null results based on the type of design. So you can see here when we look at the traditional publication method, about 10% of findings are null findings. Now, that must mean either A, we're amazing at predicting what was going to be statistically significant, or B, we're able to manipulate what we present in a manuscript to make it look like we're amazing. And indeed, when you do registered reports and pre-registrations, over here you can see that the percentage of null findings is actually even greater than 50%. Okay, so hypotheses are about 5 times more likely to be unsupported in registered reports compared to regular articles. So that's good. We see the same observation within psychology specifically here. So 96% of traditional publication processes are seen to support your hypotheses, about 43% from their registered reports. As I noted, registered reports tend to receive more citations than the average, so at their respective journal impact factor ranking. And some recent research here, which I thought was really cool, which is they evaluated various quality indicators of papers, registered reports and non-registered reports at different stages. So before knowing the study outcomes, after, and then after reading the whole thing. And they compared them, and you can see here that all the quality indicators were higher for registered reports than non-registered report articles. So it really does suggest that registered reports on every criteria are beneficial for quality over the traditional publication route. And so this and all of these reasons are why I decided to set up this project as a registered report. So A, it allowed me to guarantee you a publication before you even signed up and got started. It allowed me to develop a template and some frameworks and some support structures so that you didn't have to make lots of decisions yourself. And broadly speaking, hopefully it means that we produce better quality science because we have used robust methods that have been peer-reviewed, accepted by experts in this field to be a fair test of what we're interested in. And these are all the kind of reasons why I'm really excited for this project. Pre-registration is a really interesting strategy and procedure, part of the research process that's been more and more widely accepted across not just psychology, but across a variety of different fields. And registered reports really are the cutting edge of good practice. And so hopefully in joining me on this registered report in this project, you'll have an opportunity to get an insight into this process and perhaps even practice pre-registration yourself.